Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, as you probably might have guessed, actually, I failed to hit the microphone button. So I'm new to this online briefing malarkey, but I'm here to talk about cloud email. The objectives today are to tell you a bit about myself. I'm then going to go into a bit about the cloud email paper and take some question and answer. So I'm very keen to find out, as Catherine mentioned, from you, your experiences, whether you've moved, not moved to the cloud for email, how that's worked for you, so that we can capture these experiences. And hopefully you can all see me in a webcam now that I've enabled sharing as well. So good. Right. So I'm part of the Janet Brokerage. I'm the technical lead within that. So we're a new unit, and I'll tell you a bit about that in a second. My background is I started off as a systems engineer, so I spent a lot of time managing networks. I spent, for my sins, I managed Exchange 5.5 and Exchange 2000 and all the things around that. I moved on to be an IT manager, so I was an operations manager for 4 or 5 years, and for the last bit of my time before I joined Janet, I was a solutions architect, creating solutions mainly for schools, to build IT infrastructure, network, telephony, systems, sort of the whole 9 yards there. So that's a bit about me. So as I said, we're going to learn about the Janet Brokerage. We're going to do a bit of an overview of this paper, and then we'll share some experiences. So, right, Janet Brokerage. So this is a new element, and actually this paper is something that kind of is a good pitch. So what we're trying to do is offer advice and guidance to the sector. We also want to tie that together by understanding what suppliers offer and steering them towards what you need. So what we're trying to do overall is shape suppliers' views and their products into something that works for all of you, and also then to help you by helping you to make an informed decision. So we know that not everyone wants to do the same thing, but you've all got different issues, you've all got different problems, and it's about making the right choice for you. So also, we're not keen on duplication of effort. So what we've tried to do within this paper is a lot of good work has been done by other bodies, including JISC Legal, UCISA have captured a lot of information, and also there's been a number of institutions who have been through cloud email migrations in this case, and we've tried to gather that opinion and used it to shape the work that we've done. First things first, I thought it would be useful to find out who has moved to the cloud. One of the things that we had was who's moved to the cloud for students, who's moved for staff, and who's moved for staff and students. Because one of the reasons we put this paper together was our feeling that there were a lot of people who had thought about it for students and not so many for staff based on a variety of issues. So what we can see from that is a significant number have migrated for students, but the majority here, 2/3, have not so far. So we'll be interested to see, based on some of the other questions and thoughts coming through this, what your plans are for the future, and whether this work in any way helps, or whether we need to help you in any other way. And so, why consider cloud email? So there's a lot of talk about cloud, and there's a lot of hype about cloud as well. And so some of that is true, and some of it is not true. But there's some very specific things around email, which is quite a tangible offering that a lot of people have used either in their own sort of personal situation. So most people I know are using a cloud email system for their home email. And one of the things is money. So the infrastructure that you spend on creating an email solution within an organization is quite considerable, and there's a lot of associated things that go with that. So, for example, you've got a set of servers that will be running. You'll be looking for software from people like Microsoft or Lotus or IBM, sorry. who are, so you'll be paying annual revenue, or you'll be paying a fairly large license chunk there. You've also got things like backup, so it's lots of data. You'll have potentially a SAN, and there's some hidden costs there in that these things are going to be using electricity. So you might be burning up a fair amount of electricity. You're using a certain amount of data centers, so you might be using generators. You might have UPSs. So these are all considerations around the finance side of things, which is indicated by my pound sign. The green light bulb is just a nice picture that I found, but actually it was meant to show a bit of environmental. So it talked about electricity, but potentially it's about whether you could maybe save electricity by moving to another option, which is cloud. The third thing that I've got on there is about upgrades. So one of the things that I found was if you're in a situation where you're planning an upgrade, there's a number of considerations, not least of which is if you've bought the software outright, do you have to go and convince your finance manager, director to give you money for that? You then got to plan that, work out whether the infrastructure you've got will support it. Potentially that means more infrastructure. You're going to be communicating that to lots of people, so your stakeholders, and there's a lot of work that goes on in all of that. So one of the things that cloud potentially offers is those upgrades, but without having to take on board as much of the pain. It won't remove that, but it is a significant factor. I've sort of alluded to it, but the other thing that counts in there is the total cost of ownership. So as well as the infrastructure side of things, there's also a lot of time that gets spent in managing the email systems, managing recovery of data. I had issues where we'd run out of quota limits, all sorts of things that can happen to your email system, data corruptions, all that sort of thing. And it can take a lot of time, and generally people have specific resources dedicated to managing email systems. Again, moving on, other reasons why you might consider cloud email. So one significant aspect of some of the major providers now is that they offer basically it feels like infinite amounts of email. So you've got something like 25 gigabytes of email quota per user. In the education arena, a number are offering email for life. So they're very keen because they want to keep you working with their systems. So there's this idea of email that lasts throughout the time that you're, for example, at university, and then and that becomes an alumni email. And organisations are looking at that because they can have means by which they might be able to mail shot their alumni and keep in contact with them. Last one there is around, we've sort of talked about infrastructure, we've talked about cost of ownership. One of the things that does from a sort of financial perspective is if you move to cloud type products, they become a service, so you're paying for them per user per year. So that capital expenditure that you might spend on servers and software and backup is converted into an operational cost per year. Email is an interesting case in point that the leading vendors are actually offering their services for free. So the capital expenditure and operational expenditure is quite a significant issue because the OPEX part becomes very much more appealing. I've put together, there's 2 slides for this, but the email options in terms of the cloud fall down to 2 major players working in education, which is Google and Microsoft. And I'll move forward a slide, and then I'm going to come back. So there's the other options would be hosted Microsoft Exchange. So a number of third-party companies are offering a hosted version of Exchange. You could have Exchange yourselves, which I suspect is what 2/3 of, or near 2/3 of the audience today are using. Or you could use other cloud email providers. So there are a number of other options around. So I'm just going to go back. While I was looking at this, one thing's become clear, that these two major players are now offering these services for free. They've very much targeted education in that regard, and they've matured in terms of not necessarily the technical side of things, which I think also has happened, but in terms of how they're approaching this. So Microsoft, for example, used to offer live at EDU. They've now moved that service into their main Microsoft Office 365, which I think at some point is going to be advertised as Office 365 for Education. Google as well, offering Google Apps for Education, and they're building that on the same platform that they're using to sell to other commercial vendors, other commercial partners. So what we're seeing is these are the two large providers, and a number of other commercial providers in, for example, moving back to that slide, is if you look at the hosted Microsoft Exchange market, a number of those providers are now looking at, instead of hosting Exchange themselves, offering value-added services around the Microsoft Office 365 or potentially the Google Apps for Education. So we're seeing the market changing in that regard, where people don't want to be offering the services and having to deal with the infrastructure themselves, and that's very large providers, and they're falling back on basically those two. There are others, but I haven't dealt with them in too much detail, because I think for the education sector, these are the two most relevant. If people have feedback on that, that would be interesting to see whether there are other vendors out there that people have considered, and what their thoughts are on those. So I would definitely be interested to know about that, so we can add to the supporting documentation that we've got. There are some issues around how we move this forwards, and they're positive and negative, but they're considerations. So you've got to think about, if you're going to move this, move your information into the cloud, governance is a very big one. So I'm going to talk about data protection and that kind of thing, but the governance that surrounds your systems is important. So you need to consider whether there is an issue with the data, whose data you're managing and how it's being managed, so that you've got adequate protection. Stakeholders, so your user base and your senior management team, being good examples, will have a view on this. Some of that may be positive, and some of that may be negative. So the positives, I imagine, would be things like larger email quotas. I know that I found that the senior management in most of the companies I worked had significantly larger email quotas than everyone else in our organisation. So that was always an interesting one for us. But there's a lot of functionality that might be available. There's as you move into the cloud, but there's also issues with other people who may feel that there's privacy issues that they are concerned about. So there's a general concern around your stakeholders and technical management. So you've got a team of people who might be worrying about this at the moment. Some of this will change because the model where you're using is changing, but this is a significant consideration in terms of the rest of your infrastructure. We'll talk a bit about prerequisites, but it's about understanding what this new service will offer and what the technical issues are that surround it and how you manage that. Prerequisites, I think you all probably will know more about this than I will, but essentially what I tried to cover in the white paper was to make sure that there was some consideration of the things that you might need to do before moving between versions. Some of this will be client-based, some of this is server-based, so things like being on the right service packs, and some of it might be about new infrastructure. So depending on what you're looking at, you might need to look at, so for example, Active Direct ADFS, which is a means by which you can help your user integrate your user management. In that case, there is some new infrastructure that will need to go in place, and you'll need to make sure that that is covered. I haven't really thought this isn't really a prerequisite, but it kind of ties into stakeholders, which is if you're depending on what clients you've got out there, and the paper makes main reference to Microsoft Office because that is obviously a big chunk of people, and especially within the staff community, I should say. So we focused on that aspect, but it's about looking at the functionality that you might have with the client that you're going to have and seeing what works for your user base. Data protection and jurisdiction. So this is one of the big things around the cloud. I think, especially from a corporate perspective, this is the one that causes the most problems, and I think it also draws out some questions that are around what are you doing today versus what you would do in the cloud. What is different between the two? So I have to tell you, I'm not a lawyer, but I have I've been looking through a lot of the work on data protection that's been done by, for example, GIS Legal, and also within Janet we have people who understand that sort of thing. So I don't want to go into the details of that now because I think the paper probably lays that out a bit better than I do. But what I would say is there are a number of things around understanding who manages your data, where they manage it, and where they actively don't manage it. So there can be a perception that by moving your data away, you might be moving all your governance away. Actually, that isn't the case because you are a data controller, and even if you move to the cloud, that data control issue and the governance around that is still yours to worry about. And I think the key there is probably it becomes something for you to worry about rather than necessarily to physically do something about. So you need to be worrying about what your vendors are doing, how they're doing it, and whether that works for you. In terms of data protection, a couple of things that came to mind in terms of the data were the obvious thing that people worry about is the email in this case. So are people looking at your email? How secure is your email? And that is, in many cases, adequately addressed. What I think has been less well addressed is the associated data which might be used by vendors. So a lot of associated data that is created, such as log files that indicate when people logged into systems, how long they were on the systems for, who they were mailing, all of these associated bits of information need to be considered when you're looking at data protection, because in many ways they're just as important, and they can be in some ways more revealing about your organisation and organisational practices. So it's worth ensuring that that data is covered. I would say for the leading vendors that this does look to be covered in many ways, but again, it's something that needs to be understood so that you're aware of it. The second thing that came up a lot in my travels was the USA Patriot Act. So many people mention the Patriot Act, but I think there's a couple of key points really around that. Is that although the USA Patriot Act is the one most quoted, essentially nearly all other countries seem to have legislation that's of a similar nature, and in some cases they have far more reaching powers, such as the ability to look at any data that's coming along the wire that crosses their national boundaries and things like that. So I think organisations have a duty, if they're depending on where they're based, to report to to report within that country. So if you're an organisation with presence in the US, you will be subject to the USA Patriot Act, which is what both Microsoft and Google would be subject to. Where I think it's interesting is that idea of presence. If you're present in isn't necessarily where your headquarters are or where you would expect that company to be. Although the law hasn't really been tested, I think that the technicality of this is that most large companies will have presence outside of their own, and essentially I think that presence could be used by whichever nation was involved to invoke any national powers that they have. So I think on the one side I'd say that these rules are there, and I think whichever vendor you use in whichever country you are, you will be subject to something. And I think the key is then, if we move on, let's see. No, I'm going to come back to that. So the key is there that we need to be mindful of it, but also be aware that what the context of that is, when people are likely to do that, and what that means to you. So I'll cover that a bit later. But the next slide I've said, so help is available. So what we're trying to do at the moment is understand some of these issues and capture them. And a number of people are working on this. The maturity of cloud, well, cloud isn't that immature in many senses, especially around the commercials and contractual sense. So in a consumer manner, lots of people have been using these services and ticking a box which says something about terms and conditions. When it becomes a corporate issue, there's a lot more people involved looking at contracts and legal issues, and the national regulations are also not really designed for this. So I think it's a confusing area, and it's one that's everyone is seeking to get more clarity on. I think most nations are currently looking at cloud and the legislation they've got around it to work out how to put a more straightforward picture together that allows people to use cloud services, but not in a way that leaves them too vulnerable. So a lot of work has been done so far. So there's some legal people within Janet, but also GIST Legal and USISA that I've mentioned before. And what we're trying to do is make sure we stay on top of that and can capture it and get it out to the rest of the community. So if there are questions around that, it would be worth talking to us to see if we've done something, looking at the online resources that we have, and then the next thing is really where we go from there. So I'm interested to understand the nature of how worried people are about data protection. So there's a picture coming up, but I'm looking at poll responses coming in. I suspect that this is the big area. So I'm going to put that out on the screen. We've got quite a lot of people already, so you can start to see a picture. So I think this is a sensible view, really. And overall, what we're saying is that there are people who aren't worried, but essentially we're in two categories of slightly concerned and very concerned. And I think that matches. I think that matches the wider picture as to why people aren't or haven't yet moved. So let's move on to the next. Essentially, I think the reason different organisations move is because they have different sets of stakeholders, different sets of problems, and at the end of the day, this is going to be a judgment call. I don't think there's any definitive answer to this, but what we've tried to do is give you some information that says which way you could look to go if you wanted to go with the cloud. So the options that I've put in there are, if I'm really worried, I might look around things like not-for-profit organisations that might be doing something, or maybe shared service where it's not quite a cloud model, but the sharing together means that you would be much less worried about these issues because you'd be working in much more of a partnership basis, probably with a like-minded institution. If your main issue is with the Patriot Act itself rather than other EU national regulations, then you might look to do something around an EU-based supplier. I would say that the thing that I hadn't realised when I started this work that I do now is the US presence-based thing. So it is worth understanding what those EU-based suppliers would be subject to if they have US presence and what that means to them, if the Patriot Act is a specific example. And I think where I think things are likely to go for a lot of people, I suspect, is that the providers are going to give you enough comfort and response to address the issues that they've got so that they meet your issues and help you to move forwards. So again, these are some quite exciting things. Most of the providers offer standards. There's a lot of jargon that goes around that. Essentially, a lot of it is about means by which they can make sure that they're doing what they say they're going to be doing, and that they've addressed risk and they've thought about how they're managing data. So things like ISO 27001 is around security, 9001 is more around accurate use of processes, and then there's a series of American things, which are more American audit standards that have been used by companies to show that they can be auditable up to a certain degree. So that's this SAS and SSAE standards. So the other thing I just wanted to make a quick note of is once you've moved, and it also gave me the chance to put this random picture in the slide deck, but there's this idea of, so you move this thing, move the data into the cloud, but email is important in that it normally ties into a number of other systems. I can imagine the number of systems that do some sort of email alert or email response that comes out of your finance system or your staff student registration system. So there's a level of integration and understanding that will need to happen depending on what your technical infrastructure is. So I think it's about looking at your architecture in this particular case. But it is a concern because there may be things that are so tightly coupled that the only answer is really to make sure you've got some sort of local presence. But overall, I think there are solutions that cover that. Right, so looking at the time, okay, but I want to move this along. So there are lots of questions that you can ask, and what we've tried to do within the paper is outline what those questions are and give you some thoughts to consider. That's, if there are others, again, interested to know what else there might be, and if suppliers aren't giving good answers, I think, which is probably the more key thing, is where we feel we're not getting good answers. So there's a series of things that we need to think about in terms of your account management, how things are done with user accounts, change. One thing about features is if you're, at the moment, you'll be in control of those if you're managing something locally. If you hand that over to a cloud provider, things are different. So understanding when things change, how much control you have, when there is a point of no return and you have to change. So that's not necessarily a bad thing because you get lots of new features, but it also might be that you need to do user education or other things, and that's certainly something that's come up. I've seen from some of the case studies around. Disaster recovery and backup, so making sure that, again, this is one of those things that you might not be doing at this point, but you would need to be worried about. So making sure that your data is recoverable and backed up and can be restored. Policy, well, there's a variety of other features, but policies, the policies that they have, the features of the system, so the technical features, what do you get? Data management, we talked about data protection, what does that look like? There are some questions, and I think the paper goes into some details there to give you an idea of the sorts of things to think about. one of the things, having submitted this, is that there seem to still be some issues around sorting out contracts, which are around, there's an understanding that different institutions are having to negotiate their own contracts, get their own legal counsel effectively to work on this with the major providers. So we've taken that on board, and we're in contact with both providers at the moment to try and understand that. We are keen to understand what would work for you and what issues you still have. So, contractor or otherwise, what are the issues that you face, and what would convert your perception into something where you would move towards the cloud and cloud email specifically. So, if we could sort out some standard contracts, would this be something that would give you more comfort and make you want to move, or is it not of interest? Is it something that's not really applicable? So you're voting now. Right. So, that's good. So it's interesting, actually. In contact with the major providers, I think they have a belief that things are all in place, but I think when we talk to people who've been going through these processes, a lot of them felt it wasn't in place and they'd spent a significant amount of time. So it is the next thing on our list in terms of this particular flow of work, is to see what we can do to capture some of the good work from people around the sector, to see if we can try and help give some clarity here, so that people know what they're getting into, and potentially saves us all a lot of time and effort. So that's good to hear. What we'll do is more information will be coming out through various sort of communication channels, and we'll let you know where we're going next. Right. So this hasn't been a definitive guide to the paper. Tried to capture some of the essence of it. I think, as is on the slide, we're really interested in your feedback through the SurveyMonkey. So if you could do that. I suspect that there are 30% of people out there who've moved and have some good things to say and answers to some of the questions that come. But I think we're into the question and answer phase. Thank you very much.